11:23 a.m., August 13th, 1945. The sun slashes off the polished cowling. A white clock face on the instrument panel reads 11:23, and the world outside is a speeding quilt of blue and cloud. First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo leans into the stick, and Lil May's meat chopper answers. A heavy, propeller-driven fist that wants to go straight and fast, and then hang on like a stubborn animal. The Thunderbolt's radial coughs and surges. The nose art, painted in a hurried, affectionate hand, stares back, a caricature face, a baby's name, the blunt promise of a nickname that will not be forgotten. For a long while, the Pacific had been a place of diminishing roar. Cities had been broken by fire and steel, fleets set afire, strategic options closing in on the Japanese homeland. In the air, the great, chaotic duels that had once defined the war were thinning. Logistics, submarine lanes, and the relentless advance of carrier groups had shifted battle lines. Still, on this late August morning, a routine fighter sweep, Mission 50735, would run headlong into an unexpected concentration of enemy aircraft off the Korean coast. It would not be routine for much longer. Perdomo was 26, a young man who had learned to live with machines that would sometimes fail and with choices that demanded split-second conviction. He flew with the 57th Fighter Group, a unit with a reputation for aggressive, efficient work in the air. Their Thunderbolts were not the sleek, graceful birds some fighters were. The P-47N was big, a barrel-chested, single-engine warplane with a Pratt & Whitney radial that could swallow punishment. It carried 8 Browning 50-caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, each gun a staccato edge of American industry. The N model had wet wings, fuel tanks built into the structure of the wings, which extended its range and turned what had been a short-legged escort fighter into an aircraft capable of long-range penetration. That advantage would matter today. So would its mass and its reputation for survivability. A Thunderbolt could take glancing blows and still get a pilot home. That morning, the mission profile demanded range. The tankerless math was unforgiving. The round trip would push the limits of the wet wings, and the pilots would be flirting with reserve fuel on the return. They carried full belts, staggered loads of thousands of rounds, enough on paper for measured combat. But calculations meant little when tracers filled the sky. Perdomo's aircraft, emblazoned with the personal motto and the infant's name, Kenneth's nickname rendered in paint, was more than a machine to its pilot. Nose art in the Army Air Forces was shorthand for what kept men going. Family faces, home references, the small human symbols that made the metal a little less anonymous. Lil May's meat chopper carried the promise of return as much as the promise of fight. The flight climbed to its transit altitude, a steady line of Thunderbolts stretching like a moving iron flock. Radio chatter was clipped and efficient. Weather was clear, good shooting, bad for surprises. They crossed the Yellow Sea and turned toward Korea. The 57th's pilots were alert but not alarmed. Official intelligence didn't predict a mass engagement. Then the contact report came in. Single-engine bogies sighted below. For a brief moment the sweep held its line. Then the situation unraveled. The contact was not a scattering of isolated fighters, not the handful of trainers or scouts crews hoped to find. It was a group, more concentrated than anyone expected. From Perdomo's cockpit, the first enemy showed as a small, dark silhouette under the sun, then another, then a string of aircraft coming into view like beads on a wire. They were Japanese fighters, Nakajima Ki-84, Franks, the sleek Ki-43 Oscars, and smaller craft used for training, the biplane K-5Y Willow. Unusual company for this altitudinal band. One of these was trailing smoke, others were clean and fast. Perdomo's training kicked in. He looked for trailing fighters, those most vulnerable to a diving, high-energy attack. A trailing plane loses options. It cannot translate, cannot climb as fast, and is susceptible to the concentrated burst. In the Thunderbolt, the proper solution was obvious. Convert speed to position, come in hard, and get the first burst down the throat of the target before it knows the game has turned. He rolled the meat chopper into a long, tightening dive, the propeller spinning into a perfect strobing blur. The engine's roar grew like a freight train. The wind threatened to tear at helmet and goggles. Instruments ticked. He closed the distance fast. At 10 o'clock, up and forward, a Ki-84 lagged, smaller in the canopy, the frame wobbling with a single engine cough. Perdomo's hands found the triggers. 8 Browning barrels opened like a short, relentless thunderclap. Bullets stitched the sky. Water-cooled Japanese fuel tanks splashed back into sheets of flame. The first aircraft shuddered, the fuselage unsteady, and then a fire blooming under the wing. Oil and gas and cloth and the furious chemical of combustion took hold. The Frank rolled, wavered, and began a slow pike toward the sea. Debris separated from the tail, bits of metal and skin spiraling away. It was over fast. In the cockpit, the aftersight of flame lit Perdomo's face in the reflection of his visor. His index finger released the trigger, and the Thunderbolt, still heavy with speed, eclipsed the dying silhouette. He did not celebrate. There was no time. There was always another band of black on the horizon, always someone else deciding whether to fight or to flee. Perdomo scanned. He picked a new lead, another Frank trailing in the formation, slower to react, its pilot preoccupied or simply caught. He dove again. The second engagement was closer, bloodier in the visual sense. The enemy's wing root shuddered and then tore asunder, a ragged rip that made the plane look as if a giant had taken a scissor to it. Flames licked forward from the engine compartment. The pilot's canopy came free. Perdomo watched small figures eject as if by accident, and then saw the aircraft list and go down, a burning scab on the ocean's skin. In minutes, the Thunderbolt's guns had accounted for 2 aircraft. The entire engagement was tight, almost brutal in succession. One target found and trimmed up, the next followed without pause. The flight was a roiling ballet of speed and violence. Tracer lines turned the space into a spiderweb. They crisscrossed and vanished. Smoke columns marked successes, black vertical signatures of destruction on a sky otherwise clean. The biplane, the cheap, slow Willow used for training and odd coastal work, loomed into the scene with an almost comic incongruity, its fabric-covered wings beating at the air like nervous insects. Against a Thunderbolt, at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, it had no chance. Perdomo put a measured burst across its nose and watched it descend in slow, tragic spirals, the improvised grief of a machine that had no business sharing the same battle. All the while, the meat of the fight thickened around him. Ki-84 fighters, among the best Japanese single-engine fighters late in the war, began to show coordinated moves. One of them attempted what fighter pilots hate most, the bounce, coming from a higher position with surprise and energy, intending to drive into the enemy formation and bank out before a counterattack. Perdomo's situational mind had seen many attempts like it. The correct counter was dangerous and precise, convert the potential energy of the attacker into positional advantage, deny its run, and, if necessary, turn the tables. He had not fired all his belts yet. He felt the weight of his trigger hand and the pattern of recoil through the stick. The Thunderbolt drank rounds with a fierceness that quickly took ammunition reserves down. The P-47N's guns were voracious. 850s could cut through air and metal alike, but each second of continuous fire chewed through hundreds of rounds. When he checked his gun counters, small dials that clicked backwards as the ammo fed, he found the numbers dropping faster than he had hoped. The total for the engagement would, by mission's end, read roughly 3,000 rounds expended between him and the aircraft the fight consumed. For the moment, he dialed his shooting to short, accurate bursts, time and resource rationed into lethal patience. Then the moment came that would define this morning's flight. A Ki-84, smoking but not dead, wavered on a long descending turn. Perdomo closed to point blank, fired a controlled burst into the cockpit and engine area. The Japanese fighter erupted in flame, the fuselage folding like a hot piece of sheet metal. He watched the plane tumble and shed pieces, its silhouette dissolving into smoke and flame. It fell away, blackening a patch of sea. The rate of the fight increased, proximity tightened. From the Thunderbolt's cockpit, enemy aircraft became individual decisions rather than a mass. Each target was a human weighing choices, errors, fatigue. The meat chopper was an instrument of consequence, and so was Perdomo's judgment. He dove, he banked, he misled himself into believing in an immediacy that was dangerous. There was always more fuel to be saved, more rounds to be spent, and fewer safe margins to rely upon. Minutes thickened in the sky like syrup. Radio calls were short. A wingman's voice crackled, reporting contacts and giving position checks, but intermittent static punctured the clarity of the net. Pilots shouted into their helmets. Most of them were repeating the same mantra: sight, aim, fire, then escape. But escape requires options, and options cost fuel and ammunition. Perdomo's gauges were honest about their betrayal. Fuel was a number that dwindled toward anxiety. Aircraft weight, the drag of damage, the inefficiency of long periods at war footing, each factor demanded conservative planning. The return to base from where they were fighting would be counted in hundreds of miles of open water. The P-47's wet wings extended the Thunderbolt's reach, but they did not grant immortality. The decision tree was simple: keep fighting to secure local airspace and risk coming back to an empty tank, or disengage and risk leaving a comrade under fire. The math said, run. Perdomo did the opposite. At what felt like the 4-minute mark of his personal engagement, Perdomo noticed the last of his ammunition counters flirting with 0. His 8 guns had been laid into targets in quick succession. Belts had run dry in clipped, repeated salvos. He could feel the plane's painted weight shift in response to every maneuver. He rechecked the ammo dials and felt the cold and terrible certainty that he would not get another full burst when the next enemy passed across his gun sight. The simple mechanical truth settled over him like a cold sheet. If he tried to fire again, nothing would come out of the barrels. To most pilots, that would have been the end of a career for the day. Skillfully, they would brake, climb, and get back to the formation to ride home. But Perdomo did something that mixed calculation and courage in a way that will be argued about in bar rooms and briefing rooms for years. He turned toward the enemy. It was a tactical shove, the kind of move that relies on psychology as much as steel. A pilot runs out of ammo and runs away. An enemy pilot sees that and presses. Perdomo banked the Thunderbolt into the enemy, hands steady on the controls, posture of attack, not retreat. From the outside, it looked counterintuitive. From the cockpit, it was a wager. He would bluff an offensive posture long enough to keep attackers from pressing, buying time for a wingman to intervene, or, if necessary, making the approaching fighters think twice about their angle and timing. The sky responded with its indifferent noise: roars, distant explosions, the crack of tracer line embroidery. For a heartbeat, the bluff seemed to hold. The Ki-84 that had been nursing damage leveled its wings and hesitated, uncertain whether risk should be taken. Enemy pilots were human. They weighed risks as much as any of the Americans. The Thunderbolt's bulky shape and the vicious reputation of its guns suggested danger even when the guns were silent. But theater is cruelly literal. The enemy might see hesitation and press, or their squadron mates might not be fooled. Perdomo's gamble would have to be backed by something else. A wingman who could show up and put live rounds where his planes no longer could. His eyes scanned the sky with the acuity of someone who knows how long seconds can feel. Every cloud edge became possible cover for friend or foe. Behind him, across the scattered horizon of aircraft, the 57th's formation was holding pockets of near violence. One of Perdomo's squadron mates was threading through the chaos with real ammo and a will to use it. Out of the corner of his canopy, Perdomo glimpsed movement that could be aid or threat. He kept his nose up, kept the meat chopper in a posture that suggested the fight was far from over. Adrenaline honed his thought. The cockpit smelled of oil and heat. His gloves were damp with sweat. He felt the plane as an extension of his nerves. Then, a shape arced into his peripheral vision, a friendly silhouette descending, guns opening on a target that threatened Perdomo's tail. The sound of another pilot's gunfire was the most welcome noise he had heard in minutes, metal against metal, an orchestra delivering salvation. But the moment of rescue was not yet complete. Perdomo still had to nurse the Thunderbolt home, if they could withdraw together. The plane was dinged, not catastrophically, but in a way that would complicate the long return. His oil pressure read lower than before. There was smoke in the canopy, a thin, acrid ribbon from some mangled wingtip. Instruments tempered hope with reality. They had enough hydraulic fluid and structural integrity to fly, but not much margin. The nearest airfield was hundreds of miles behind them. In the sky, the ballet continued, one pilot wounded, another pressuring, tracer curtains thrown up like netting across blue. Perdomo's cheeks were set. He cupped the stick and let the meat chopper fly by will and instinct. He had counted on his gunshed bluff to buy a moment. Now the next decision would be whether he and his savior could translate that moment into the more mundane, merciless arithmetic of fuel and distance. They would have to thread a path home across empty ocean with an aircraft that might not hold together under full stress. They would have to trust their wingman to keep the last dangerous angles covered while they burned towards range. They would have to trust that the Japanese pilots, many of whom were experienced and desperate, would not press the attack when they sensed weakness. Perdomo thumbed the radio, voice low yet firm. "I'm out," he said simply. No bravado, no flourish. It was a statement of fact. The reply crackled, affirmative and immediate, a relief that eased for a second the pressure inside the cockpit. The other pilots, hearing a comrade report empty guns, adjusted their tactics. The squadron shifted, protecting and corralling, buying the empty-gunned Thunderbolt a route away from the tightest clusters of enemy fighters. Even as they pulled out of immediate danger, the mental toll gathered. Perdomo watched the sea under them for signs of wreckage. Black smoke, oil slicks, sinks of improbable tragedy. Each downed foe meant a human life ended in a violent stroke. Each damaged plane was a family letter waiting to be written. Combat does not produce simple winners. It produces outcomes catalogued later in neat columns on debrief sheets. But the pieces of those outcomes are messy and permanent. As the group reformed, the math of fuel returned to the fore. The P-47's wet wings had bought them an extended range, but no pilot could ignore the final calculus, distance to Eshima, where their unit staged for forward operations, versus current fuel, headwinds, and the drag of battle damage. The instruments would not lie. The human heart might try to hope. Perdomo's mind ran the numbers with the efficiency of experience. At this rate, with that damage, with that reserve of oil pressure, they could scrape to base if they set their final approach carefully and kept the throttle out of the worst of the envelope. Behind their immediate concerns loomed a larger fact. Whatever reckoning the gun cameras had recorded, the clear, merciless visual proof of what had been destroyed, would later be the document that confirmed kills, that turned momentary chaos into official credit. Those small black and white reels, mounted in the nose, had a way of deciding history. For now, though, the footage would become a later argument. In the sky, the argument was about survival. The Thunderbolt set an efficient course, one that hugged a line of longitude toward the faint coastlines. Pilots kept talking in clipped tones, exchanging landmarks and fuel checks with the plain mathematical cadence of men who often speak to machines more readily than to each other. Perdomo watched the horizon compress into a long, flat line. He kept his hands where they had to be, the fury of the engine a constant thrumming in his chest. As they made their way back, small groups of Japanese aircraft still orbited in the distance, scouts, pickets, whatever pocket of resistance remained wilting under the larger strategic weight of a global war fatiguing toward its end. Each contact they avoided by discretion or chance was a saved life. Each bomber they intercepted or fighter they downed was recorded in flight logs, destined to be counted later as part of a morning that became more than any one man's story. By the time the formation drew nearer to the friendly islands that marked temporary haven, Yashima, Eshima, the names used interchangeably in hurried notes and radio calls, the adrenaline that powered the fight had drained into a dull, exhausted clarity. Pilots checked systems with careful hands, ground crews below prepared to receive machines that had been to the edge and back. Some of them had seen more than one pilot on a single morning dusted with battle grime. Perdomo felt something like the numbness of an overused muscle, relief threaded with a residue of tension. Plane and pilot had made choices that morning, choices that might later look reckless or right depending on what a camera or a debriefing declared. He knew already that the gun camera would have captured slices of the engagement, short reels where tracer met fabric and metal parted company. He also knew that official credit would be slow and exacting. Claims had to be reviewed, corroborated. The immediate work was simpler. Get home, debrief, lick wounds, count what could be counted. The meat chopper's nose dipped as they fell into the traffic pattern, the heavy weight of the Thunderbolt settling into approach speeds. Perdomo ran the checklist with motions so practiced they bordered on ritual, radios scrolled with static, and the weary voices of men who had been at it for years. Somewhere on the field, men craned their necks to see the returning shape, to judge whether the paint looked like victory or sacrifice. No one cheered on the radio. The war had taught them restraint. Their feelings would be catalogued in letters, in medals, in the silence of those who had seen friends fall. But the aircraft itself, the pitted, hot, still-singing meat chopper, had a presence. Dirt and smoke streaks marred its fuselage. A shuttered panel here, and a bent propeller blade there, were the ledger of a morning of violence. They taxied to dispersal. Ground crews moved like practiced ants, pulling and checking, looking for leaks, calling for stretchers when necessary, handing out cigarettes to steady hands. Pilots stepped down from their cockpits into the brittle, sun-drenched air of the field. Faces were blackened with oil and concentration. Perdomo removed his helmet and squinted into sunlight that felt in its ordinary cruelty like a benediction. In the debriefing room, the air was cooler and quieter, but the undercurrent of intensity remained. Pilots lined up at a long table, pens and ink at the ready. The debrief would be measured, methodical, meant to convert heat-of-the-moment testimony into sober, verifiable claims. The gun camera reels would be run and rerun. Witnesses would be asked for times and angles. Names would be written down and eventually attached to official records. Perdomo answered questions with a tone that was both flat and precise. He described sequences, who had been where and when, how each target had been selected and engaged. When asked about ammunition, he admitted the truth, the meat of evacuation of his belts, and when asked why he had turned toward the enemy without rounds, he gave the same answer any pilot would: to protect his wing, to force a pause, to gamble on help arriving. Such choices are often described later as courageous or foolhardy. At the time, they are merely necessary. Somewhere in the back of the room, an intelligence officer rewound a projector and watched, frame by frame, the black and white evidence that a bulging can had recorded from the nose. The camera, registering the world in stark gradations, showed an arc of tracers, a plane's skin irradiated into atoms, and the slow, inevitable descent of a craft gone faulty. The pictures would be the foundation of the claims. They would be the hard currency of recognition. But in that moment, before the footage was fully processed, the room hummed with a quieter thing, the knowledge that whatever credit would be allotted, whatever medals would be considered, the blunt fact remained that men had been thrown against one another in the air, and that some would not return to the field's edges. Perdomo stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the weight of the day press against his ribs. He would later be recognized for what had happened in those minutes. The paperwork would reflect confirmed downings and official credit. For now, his concern was more immediate, for the men he had seen fall, for the men on his wing, for the child whose painted name rode the thunderized nose of his plane, and for whom all this danger had been given a small, private face. Outside on the airfield, maintenance crews began the routine of unmaking the fight from the machines that had borne it. Men climbed into wings and crawled into nacelles, fingers tracing seams and fasteners, listening for the whispers of metal telling stories of near misses. The meat chopper would be inspected and its scars logged. Somewhere, a technician would pull the gun camera film and begin the process of making the morning's violence into a sequence of frames, objective, unblinking, so that the military could do what militaries must: count, verify, and, if warranted, honor. But even while the official mechanisms turned, the immediate wind of the morning still whistled in Perdomo's ears. He felt a strange cocktail of fatigue and adrenaline hang on like a second skin. He went back to his aircraft one last time to look up at the nose art that had, in some private way, kept him steady in the cockpit. The painted baby's face seemed smaller under the morning sun, and yet it still stared out with that small human insistence. He reached out and ran a gloved hand across the paint. A gesture maybe ritually private, a touch of thanks, a touch of superstition, perhaps the only prayer a soldier can sometimes find. Later, when the film was processed and the room hushed with the exactness of an intelligence hangar, the gun camera footage would show specific acts of destruction, the clearest evidence that would be used to adjudicate claims. Officers would look for frames where tracer met skin, and the enemy plane began its fatal descent. Witness statements would be cross-checked. Perdomo's name would appear in the lists. The 57th Fighter Group would, in sum, be credited for an extraordinary tally that day, their ratio and tenacity earning them official citations. But those formalities had not yet been awarded. The sun was lowering a fraction. Pilots filed by the debriefing room, tired and silent. There were small, private conversations, some laughter that tasted faintly of grief, some cigarettes passed without ceremony. Fathers and brothers and boys, who had been in one place and then another in a single morning, moved through each other in the tired choreography of survival. Back at dispersal, the Thunderbolt's metal cooling under the late light, Perdomo sat by the wing and watched the sea. He thought of home. Not with the intoxication of misremembered idyll, but with the raw, simple desire for a table and a child's voice and the absence of engines. The world was changing, he knew, not in the maps that men drew, but in the small, irreplaceable measures of a life. Days with children, a wife's laugh, the slow accumulation of ordinary presence. For the moment, he carried those thoughts like ballast. Somewhere in the network of military channels that crisscrossed the Pacific this August, messages would be written that would place this morning into a record. Times and numbers and the clipped language of citations and commendations. But standing by the meat chopper, Perdomo felt the simple human score of the day. He had flown, he had fought, he had returned. That was the sum, immediate and unarguable. There were other stories that morning, other pilots whose fates would be woven into the 57th's record. A few returned with heavy damage, limping home to fields they had known since training days. Others would never step again onto airfield soil. And there would be a later reckoning, cold and bureaucratic. Who had fired which burst, where tracers had connected, how many rounds had been expended, and who had been saved because someone else took a risk. For Perdomo, the adrenaline that had been the sharpest part of combat began to dull into bone-deep tiredness. He rolled a cigarette between two fingers and breathed in its thin smoke without really tasting it. He listened to the field's low noises, the clank of tools, the murmur of men, the distant sound of a truck motor. The meat chopper's engines had fallen silent, but the memory of their roar persisted as a pressure behind his eyes. What would come next? Official credit, awards, the slow public mapping of heroism and consequence would decide how the story was told in brief military lines and in papers signed by distant brass. But for now, the immediate fact held. A single P-47, painted with a baby's name and a cheeky title, had waded into a swarm of experienced adversaries and had not only returned, but had forced a recalibration of what a Thunderbolt could do in the hands of a pilot who read the sky both like a map and a challenge. The meat of the morning's fight had been burned into reels and the memories of the men who flew. In the hours that followed, the base would erupt into the quieter work of measuring those memories against material evidence. Figures would be tallied, gun camera frames would be frozen and studied. Arguments about credit would be made with a mixture of pride and the bitter knowledge that each mark on a log corresponded to a life in a frame of film. Perdomo stood and stretched a stiff back, thinking for the first time of the paperwork that would inevitably come. Debriefings, statements, signatures, and perhaps, for him, medals. He thought of the small painted face on his nose art and of the hand-painted words beneath it, names and jokes that would follow him into those forms. He thought, too, of the strange irony that hovered on the day. The world was folding toward an end, yet battles like this still broke out with their full human cost. That irony would not lessen the fact that men had been placed in harm's way and that some would not return. And yet, as he walked away from the thunderbolt that had carried him through the morning, there was a quiet sense that the machine itself would live on in stories, at reunions, in official logs, in the minds of pilots who had seen what it could do. Lil May's meat chopper would be painted in histories and museum placards. Its nicknamed Hyde would be a shorthand for a single dramatic intersection of technology and human resolve. Night was coming on the island airfield. The men filed into mess halls and tents, a soft swarm of bodies seeking food and sleep. Reports would be written. The gun camera film would be developed and would later be the piece of evidence that transformed a chaotic morning into a countable accomplishment. Awards might be proposed. Names would be recorded. But there remained one stubborn, unresolved piece of the day. What exactly the cameras had captured, and whether what they showed would be sufficient to uphold dramatic claims. The reels would tell a part of the story, but not its entirety. There would be disputes, clarifications, and the slow advance of bureaucracy that loves fact and distrusting order more than myth. Perdomo found himself outside the debriefing tent once more, hands in the pockets of his flight jacket, watching the sky where the last tracer smoke still made long, pale ribbons toward the horizon. His lungs expanded slowly. The afternoon sea wind tasted of salt and distance. He had done what he had been trained and what he had chosen. He had engaged, he had defended, and he had returned. Soon enough, men would come to him with forms and signatures. They would ask for exact times and for details that would have to be sifted from memory and from film. What the records would show, how many confirmed planes, how many shared credits, would change how the event was described in official pages. But at that precise, fragile hour, Perdomo allowed himself a moment of private reckoning. He had looked danger in the eye, and he had acted. Whether that action would be folded into public honor or quietly rest in memory would come later. When he finally turned away from the field and walked toward the officers' quarters, the meat chopper sat under a lowing sky, its scarred fuselage cooling, waiting for men whose business was to make sense of what had happened. Pilots talked in small clusters, their voices low. Some names were spoken with a reverence that felt ceremonial. Others were weighed with sadness or anger. The pilot community had its own ways of cataloguing meaning. Inside a small room, an intelligence sergeant would soon thread the gun camera film into a projector, the whirring of film punctuating the hush. Frames would pass, a nose cone here, a wingtip there, tracer streaks frozen in mid-arc. The film would be ammunition for decisions and affirmation. It would also be the first public, mechanical witness to a series of choices made in a white-hot moment. Outside, the field lights came up like small constellations. The world resumed its larger order, while inside the tent, a small cell of men watched, rewound, and recorded. For Perdomo, for the men of the 57th, and for the pilots whose lives had brushed and broken that morning over Korean water, the day's events were not yet fully resolved. The film would tell a part. Human testimony would fill some of the rest. Official credit would coagulate slowly with the meticulous temperament of bureaucracy. But the sky had marked its truth with smoke and metal, and nothing would erase the fact that a Thunderbolt called Lil May's meat chopper had gone into a fight and had come back bearing the heavy ledger of what it had cost. If you love untold aviation stories like this one, hit like and subscribe. There are more of these moments waiting to be unraveled. When the projector's light first hit the screen, frames flickered and the room leaned forward. The images were stark and merciless. Bursts of tracer, a plane rupturing into flame, a biplane folding down. Men pointed in silence. The gun camera had done its grim work. Still, film is a blunt instrument. It showed what happened, not always who deserved credit for it. That determination would be the next act. For the pilots who had flown that morning, for Perdomo in particular, the outcome was already beginning to ripple beyond the field, into reports, into citations, into conversations in far-off offices where names and numbers will be weighed and adjudicated. Perdomo returned, sleep-starved, to a small bunk, the day replaying in fragments behind the lids of his eyes. He thought of the men who had not been so fortunate, and of the children at home who would be waiting for their father's returns. His hand brushed against the pocket where a small photograph had been folded, the face of a child, the name painted. The small photograph had been folded. The face of a child, the name painted beneath it in a hand that knew how to make a joke out of fear. Kenneth. He kept that scrap of paper close, an anchor no gun camera or medal could replace. Sleep came in fits, images looped behind his lids, tracer threads, the flash when metal met fabric, the sudden absence where a silhouette had been. Morning light arrived with the same indifferent insistence as the engines had. Time to eat, time to move, time to answer questions that would translate a furious hour into official language. At the intelligence hangar, Perdomo watched the projector one more time as the film rolled. Slow now, each frame demanding attention. Tracer arcs. The exact instant where a wing tore. A biplane folding like a paper toy. Smoke, then descent. The images were blunt and final in a way no witness could be. The film did what film does. It turned chaos into frames. It did not soften the fact that human lives were reduced to a few seconds of movement and a black smudge on the water. It did, however, give the reviewing officers the hard visual evidence they needed to adjudicate claims. They paused, rewound, not to luxuriate in victory, but to give the event the sober treatment it required. Frames were compared. Pilot statements were read aloud and cross-checked. The numbers on the ammunition counters were confirmed against reported firing times. When the papers were finally filled and the argument settled, the gun camera frames supported 4 clear destructions attributable to Perdomo's aircraft. Intelligence officers, factoring shared observations and witness corroboration, credited him with 5 victories that day. The Air Force record would later note that tally with the dispassion of ledger-keeping. Pilots in the hangar, with grease on their hands and salt on their lips, would tell a story with a different grammar, one of timing, of the split-second bluff that had saved a comrade, of the meat chopper's stubborn presence in the sky. Word spread, the way news travels on airfields, through the mess hall, over the fence, in low-voiced conversations near maps and maintenance logs. The 57th Fighter Group's debriefing files began to fill with notation. Mission 507-35, multiple contacts, heavy ammunition expenditure, confirmed kills, aircraft damaged. The tally of the group's results that day drew a line in the record that would be cited again. The unit's remarkable kill ratio and the performance of its Thunderbolts did not go unnoticed by higher command. Soon dispatches moved up channels recommending formal recognition. The 57th would receive a presidential unit citation for the group's aggressive action and results. Perdomo's individual action, his audacious choice to present an offensive posture while empty-gunned and wounded, would be singled out for special consideration. The Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest awards for valor, would follow. When citations arrived and signatures were applied, the bureaucracy translated peril into honor. The words on the award never quite captured the live complexity of a moment, the way fear and calculation braided into a single motion in a cockpit 3/4 of a world away. But they did provide official recognition. For Perdomo, there was no joy in paper. There was only a quiet sense of relief that the record had gone the way the men who had watched the film and heard the testimony believed it should. Awards do not heal, but they do make visible what was done. The rest of that summer moved in the measured steps of an army balancing operations and diplomacy. Unbeknownst to many of the pilots who read and signed creased forms and received commendations, the strategic horizon of the war was tilting toward an end. 48 hours after Perdomo's fight, an interval measured now with an ironic and awful precision, the empire he had engaged would signal its surrender. The intense calculus that sent men into combat in mid-August 1945 was a last bloody bloom before the great folding of conflict. That irony would follow men home, glory and grief arriving beside one another in the same pages of newspapers. Perdomo stayed in service. The war did not conclude for many who had begun to rebuild civilian lives. The post-war world demanded experienced pilots. He returned to duty as the Air Force restructured and new conflicts rose. He flew again in the Korean War, an era that tested air power in new ways and demanded the same combination of skill and nerve that had marked his Thunderbolt days. He carried the meat chopper memory with him. The nose art, the rattled paint, the way an aircraft becomes a vessel not just of machines, but of meaning. Back home, life produced the small ordinariness that every returning airman hoped for. Kenneth grew older in photographs and in memory, the baby whose name had been painted across metal that had known violence. Family dinners and shore leaves would break up the tension of uniforms and maps. Yet the consequences of war are rarely confined to the battlefield. Years later, that same conflict, unfolding in a different place, with new weapons and new politics, would touch the Perdomo family again. His son Kenneth, who had been the tender symbol on a painted nose, was deployed to Vietnam and did not return. The loss landed with the blunt, unassailable sorrow that kills move through families. It was a private tragedy that connected, in the long arc of history, two wars separated by geography but bound by their human cost. When Perdomo died in 1976, his life had been folded through combat and service and sorrow. His ashes were scattered over the Pacific, the ocean that had been the theater of his greatest fight, and, in a sense, the witness to his life's more consequential moments. The maritime horizon that had once been horizon lines on a cockpit dial became his final resting place. There is a solemn poetry in that. A man returned to the wide, indifferent sea that had shaped so much of his story. The meat chopper, Lil May's meat chopper, lived on in a different way. Aircraft carry stories like other objects keep fingerprints, the paint, the chips, the names scrawled in the maintenance bay. Thunderbolts that survived were preserved and restored. Enthusiasts and museums sought out those machines, and reproductions of nose art were painstakingly recreated so that future generations could see the crude, earnest humor of men trying to humanize a fighting machine. The 57th Fighter Group's name was placed alongside other units on memorials and in museum exhibits, its presidential unit citation a textured badge among many. Airshows sometimes brought a painted P-47 into the sunlight, An airplane that looks impossibly large in slow rolls, its radial engine a reminder that brute force and mechanical resilience played as much a role as pilot skill. Reenactors and curators explained wet wings and Browning .50 caliber armament to crowds who pressed faces to glass. For those who had been there, the sight of a Thunderbolt still conjured that August morning over Korea. The smell of burned fabric, the flash of tracer, the way a bulky airplane could turn the tide of a fight by sheer mass, and the resolve of its pilot. For newcomers, the display was part machine study, part story, how technology and daring coalesced into moments that altered reputations and forged folklore. Historians would later analyze the P-47's role in the Pacific's last months with critical attention. The aircraft's radial engine and heavy construction lent it survivability. Its wet wings gave it reach. Those technical factors mattered, but so did the human variables, training that encouraged hunting the trailing fighter, the audacity of pilots willing to convert momentum into positional advantage, and the squadron culture that emphasized mutual protection. Perdomo's choice to bluff an offensive posture while out of ammunition became a case study in applied psychology. How posture can redirect enemy decisions and buy life-saving seconds. It was not a tactic without risk, but it was a move that relied on the enemy's uncertainty, on an opponent's calculus about whether an apparent advantage was a trap. The numbers from that morning were stark and carried weight in official reports. Approximately 3,000 rounds expended between Perdomo and his adversaries, multiple aircraft destroyed, and a unit returned that morning intact enough to warrant a presidential unit citation. The gun camera footage, black and white, grainy and merciless, remained the documentary anchor for those claims. When film and testimony aligned, history had less reason to argue. Still, for every official notation there was another ledger, the tally of grief. Pilots who returned with holes in their planes returned with different kinds of holes inside themselves. Some drank, others stayed to fly until their hands would no longer steady. Some buried themselves in service or family. Perdomo's later years were lived with an awareness that exceptional moments leave traces. He never claimed to feel like a hero in the pure, uncomplicated sense. He understood the moral weight of the destruction he had helped sow, and the human losses that followed on both sides. In historical retellings, the scene is often distilled. One pilot, a big, brash fighter, a handful of skilled adversaries, and an audacious bluff that buys time. The reality, the clumped, uncomfortable center of the story, was both simpler and more complicated. Simple in the sense that the tactical choices were pragmatic responses to immediate threats and dwindling ammunition. Complicated because decisions made under pressure reverberated through lives for decades. The timing of the engagement in the last frantic days of a global war adds a hard-edged irony that historians note without easy comfort. 48 hours after a young lieutenant in a Thunderbolt tore through a band of Japanese fighters, the instruments of state began to quiet, yet the mechanics of conflict, training, chance encounters, local intelligence failures and successes had already created stories not so easily folded into a piece. Perdomo's fight remains one of those moments where a single sortie contains within it the manifold contradictions of war. Skill and improvisation that saved fellow airmen, lethal consequences that touched families on both sides, and a machine, Lil May's meat chopper, that became a shorthand for a pilot's daring and for the aircraft's mechanical character. Museums and memorials today preserve fragments of that morning. A preserved P-47N, or a replica thereof, sometimes carries painted words that recall the cheeky bravery of the original nose art. Gun camera stills, printed and framed, show the tracer arcs and the final descent of enemy aircraft. The Distinguished Service Cross citation, the unit's Presidential Unit citation, and the mission reports are catalogued in archives and made accessible to researchers and family members seeking to understand what happened. For those who come to these exhibits, the objects, metal and paper, prompt a set of questions. How did machines and men cohere under pressure? What did courage look like in practical terms? What of the human costs lingered long after the engines fell quiet? The story is worth retelling because it is compact and instructive. It gives a clear example of how aircraft design, range, armament, survivability interlocks with pilot training and split-second judgment to determine outcomes. It is also worth retelling because it shows the human consequences. The way a painted baby's name on a nose cone encodes hope and vulnerability, and how that same family would later bear another deeper sacrifice. There is teaching and there is mourning in that arc. On the anniversary of the engagement, veterans associations and historians convene to remember. Pilots who flew with the 57th sometimes gather at reunions, swapping frames and memories, not to boast, but to account and to grieve. Younger generations, drawn to the drama of airborne combat, listen and take notes. They photograph nose art reproductions and read citations aloud. They learn that a Thunderbolt's strength was not a guarantee of invulnerability. They learn that audacity matters, but so does the ethic of mutual protection. In the end, the meat chopper's legacy is not an argument that the P-47 always dominated, nor a simplistic claim that it alone decided battles. It is a portrait of interplay, of man and machine, of calculated risk and instinct, and of the moral fog of combat. Lil May's meat chopper showed Japanese fighters who was boss in the immediate arithmetic of a fierce encounter that morning. But it also left a complex human ledger that outlived the tight arcs of tracer and flame. We close where the cockpit once was warm, with an image of a weathered Thunderbolt on display, nose art visible, its paint dulled, but its lines unmistakable. Nearby, a small black-and-white photograph of a boy rests under glass. Kenneth's face, the very image that once steadied a man at combat's edge. Visitors pause, reading the short caption that accompanies the display. The date, the name, the awards, the unit citation. They look up at the engine cowling and imagine the sound. They think for a second about the strange mixture that defines combat memory. The pride of having done a job, the sorrow for those who could not be saved, the quiet grief that follows families for generations. If you've been moved by this kind of story, consider sharing where you're watching from in the comments and visiting the museum pages linked below for more primary sources and archival footage. Lil May's meat chopper did its work in a sky about to fall silent. Its story, brave, conflicted and lasting, reminds us that moments of skill and courage do not erase the costs of war, but they do teach us about the human choices inside the machines we fly.